And there we go. And we are officially recording. So hello, Jesse. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing really well. Thank you very much for doing this and for being here.
Yeah, no problem.
So we're kicking off our next topic series. We kind of break it down. I compartmentalize a lot of my life, and this is how I set it up. So this topic series is called Spirituality and Practice. And what I wanted to focus on with this was floating. And it's a practice that I came into a couple years ago, not too long ago. And I was just I've really come to embrace the process, although it's taken me a little while, but I really do love it, and I want to get into more about it, and hopefully for those that may not be aware, just more about it. And you own Float Toronto.
That's right. Yeah.
And I just recently had a float in your studio, and we were just talking about it previous to recording, and it was magic. Magic for so many reasons we'll get into, and just any opportunity I have for quiet time without children. Although I do love my children, is just magical as well. So, my first question is, how did you come to floating? Like, what gravitated you toward this business, this process? How did you get into it?
Yeah. I'll kind of go through a little origin story of
Okay.
how it came to be. Um, Basically, around 8 years ago, me and a friend of mine had a couple small businesses that we were running, and I think we always were kind of had this idea in our head that one day we're going to do something a little bit bigger. And as well as being a little bit bigger, we wanted to do something that would have a positive impact on the world and our community around us, that kind of thing. So we kind of had that thought on our radar of like, okay, what are we going to do? And at that time, floating came up on our radar, something we heard about online, and it wasn't really widely accessible at the time at all. We're going back to like 2011, around there.
Right.
So at first, it was just something that started out as a hobby that we pursued as something we were interested in, and we were both interested in holistic health and stuff like that. I was actually studying holistic health, holistic nutrition at the time. So I also kind of wanted to do something related to that, and I wasn't sure what it was going to be. So we went, and the first place I floated was in somebody's basement outside of Vancouver.
Oh my God.
So like floating's been around for quite a while. I mean, we'll get into a little bit of the history of it, but like there's all these sort of remnants of sort of float tanks from a prior wave of floating.
Yes.
Um, and these tanks have kind of wound up in, one-off places here and there, so it seems.
Yep.
So I drove about 3 hours outside of the city and paid $100. I remember that very clearly. It was $100 cash. And I was there with my stepbrother, and the tank was a really old style tank. And he floated first. I waited in the waiting room. I was reading some books about floating, and then I went in after him, and we both had really great experiences. It was one of those things where, after the first time trying it, it was like, whoa, this would be really cool if this could be, part of our regular routine, part of our life. And then after that, we ended up, like I said, it became a hobby. We traveled around, we tried different centers, different styles of tanks and stuff like that. And it was only later that we were like, hey, I think we could, I think we can make a business out of this. Like, I think there's a demand for this based on how many people know about it and how little actual access there was at the time. Like, there really wasn't anything,
Right.
in the area, maybe a couple tanks operating in Canada at the time. So, that's kind of the nutshell of it. One thing led to another. We were originally going to start it in Vancouver. And then about halfway through the planning process, we pivoted and decided to come out to Toronto because another center actually opened up in Vancouver.
Oh,
And yeah, they did a really, really great job. They really nailed it and hit it out of the park. It was a beautiful center. We actually started floating there, and that's where kind of the last half of our sort of manifestation process, I think, took place, where we got a lot of our ideas. And yeah, we ended up coming out to Toronto and starting our center on the west side here. Yeah.
I remember I heard about floating. Actually, my husband told me about floating, and he heard it from Joe Rogan.
That's where we heard it as well. That was the first. That was the
I
first
think,
place
like,
that we heard it. So
yeah,
I'll share one little point about that, because it was an interesting phenomenon that I think is cool to recollect. So there was something that happened, especially now when Joe Rogan has become so popular in the media. It's interesting to look back, because he was in sort of the early wave of podcasters, and his
yeah,
podcast was, really obviously become massive, but it was even really big back then. And something happened where he started mentioning it on his podcast, because he has a tank in his house. And he was talking about all the benefits and everything he gets out of it and how much he enjoys it. And like basically overnight almost, there was a situation where there was like millions of people who became aware of this modality that literally wasn't accessible to anyone.
yeah,
Like, you know what I mean? Like,
100%.
all these people were like, whoa, that's really cool, but like there was nowhere to do it. So we were part of that first wave of like getting into it, and then realizing, okay, if we do start a center, there's one thing that we know, and it's that there's millions of people that have an awareness about this, and those are going to be our first clients. Those are going to be the first people that gravitate to us, and that's exactly what happened. The first bunch of people that I think gravitated towards our center, and even the first few staff that we hired, were just totally on the same wavelength from that phenomenon. So yeah, it
Yeah.
was cool.
And my husband mentioned it to me because we were actually just starting to get into more meditative manifestations and practices. He heard it on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's like, "Okay, I want you to hear this episode." And I was obsessed with podcasts, still am, but I listened to this, and then I heard it, and I'm like, "Absolutely not, 100% no."
Yeah.
And he was like, "Why?" And then he started actively looking where we could float, and I was like, "I'm not going." And he's like, "Why?" I'm like, "Because." And then there's pictures of it, and the pictures that I saw, and again, we'll get into this, but like, I'm like, "I can't do that. It's dark. Like, I can't do that. There's no way." And then Joe, again, has since mentioned it many, many times. And then within that year, in our local area, one opened. And my husband was like, I'm going. Come with me. So then he went, and then I went, and then that's how it started. But literally, it was
And
within
that's in
that
Barrie, right? Amazing.
year. Say that again, sorry.
In Barrie, right?
In Barrie,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's where our center opened. And that's, yeah. And then ever since then, it's taken some time, but that's literally how it came to be, was where it was Joe Rogan. So my next question, can you give me, because you had mentioned some context, because floating has been around longer than people realize, but the accessibility has drastically changed of popularity and media, etc. But the idea of floating and the practice of it has been around as far as I John Lilly is a name that in my research I came across, and he's kind of the pioneer of sort of this whole practice. And that was like late 60s, I think 70s is what I came to. So can you provide some context of sort of how this came to be and the science kind of within it?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So he's the guy, John Lilly. He was a neuropsychologist, and he was primarily interested in the brain and how the brain works, and also in the studying of consciousness.
Right.
Those were his kind of main interests from what I gather and from what I've read. And it actually originated a little bit earlier than that. It started in the mid 50s.
Oh, okay.
So he was doing all types of wacky experiments in his studies of the brain and consciousness, and he wanted to figure out a way that he could basically isolate his subjects and take away all stimulus so that he could measure different things going on in the brain and stuff like that. So the original tank that he was working with was actually a tank where the person would go upright, and they had a contraption over their head, like a full helmet with a breathing tube, and the tube would go out the top of the tank. It looked really creepy, like a super sci-fi. And the person would just like bob on the top of the water. and relax into that same relaxing float experience where you're just like completely limp and letting go, and neutral water temperature and things like that. And then it was later that they figured out if they added a lot of Epsom salt and changed the density of the water, they could lie in a supine position on their back. And that's when the next rendition of the float tank that ended up becoming the first commercial style float tank was created, more around the 70s, early
Okay.
70s.
Now, for those that, okay, so I'm going to back up a bit, because for those that have never floated before and that have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, or have heard of it but have no idea what to expect. So can you take me through, let's just say I'm interested in a float and I've never done it before. So can you take me through, I show up at the center, I walk in, and what would happen? What would I have to do what would the experience look like?
Yeah. So the whole idea of the float is to basically restrict all external stimulus. That's what we're trying to achieve here. So there's about between 1,000 and 1,200 pounds of Epsom salt in about 11 inches of water, 10 and a half, 11 inches of water. So much Epsom salt that you're completely buoyant as you
Right.
lie on the water. And when you go to a float center, everything's pretty much provided for you in terms of towels and soaps and conditioners and hair dryers, things like that. You don't have to wear anything in the tank. That's the best way to go into it, because you don't want any distraction or any tactile sensation on your skin. So basically, you'll go into a room that has a shower and a float tank, and you'll have a shower, rinse off, and then make your way into the tank, lie down. And like I said, because the water is heated to the same temperature as your skin, so somewhere around
Yes.
93.5 degrees Fahrenheit,
Mm-hmm.
when you are, kind of get into that stillness and relax into the experience, the boundaries between your body and the water sort of dissolve to the point where, if you're really still, you won't even really be able to tell, like, if the tops of your fingers are in the water or not. For me, it always manifests in a way where I'm like, I can't really feel my body. I can't feel my legs. Till even
Right.
now, to the point where I'll like move my leg just to like make sure it's there almost. And it's in that state that you can kind of, ease yourself into a pretty deep, relaxation, some kind of meditative state. And it's a little easier to do it in there, I think, because, like there's a total lack of stimulation coming into your brain.
Right. So you walk in, and I also recognize like different centers have different types of tanks in terms of like that will vary based on sort of what's available to you. But basically, you walk in, you rinse off, take your clothes, and it's very private, obviously. So like the rooms are individualized. You rinse off, you go into the tank, you're lying flat, like you said, 1,000 to 1,200 pounds of Epsom salt, and idealistically, you would close the door and you would sort of be buoyant within that and sort of allow your body and your muscles to relax. Now in your center there is the availability, you can turn the lights off or on because you have little dimmer lights within your tank.
Mm-hmm.
But again, ideally the lights would be off, but for those kind of making their way like me, get into my experience of how I had to do it, it took a while, as well as sound. So I know you can request to have some music playing, some type of calming type of music, or it can, in an ideal situation, it would be completely off, so you yourself are floating, buoyantly on the top of the water, and essentially in darkness and no sound.
That's right.
And sort of your body, I think it's the yoga nidra state, where how I always understood it, if being awake is white and being asleep is black, the yoga nidra is the gray that your body kind of starts to melt into. So you're obviously aware, but you can't necessarily differentiate between where your body starts and the water starts. And it's usually when you're in a really dark place, your eyes kind of adjust.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, your eyes, like, it's dark.
It's pitch black.
It's dark. Yeah. It's dark. So like your eyes, and it's part of that process of just being completely still. So, and then you get out of the tank, and you rinse off, and you kind of just go about your day. So thank you, just to provide that context for people that have never set foot in a center and would never even know kind of what to expect in that.
Totally. And you did a great job of recapping that. And we've really, and all centers, we've all really thought of everything.
Yeah.
Like even at the end of the session, the way that we wake you up is the music will kind of come on lightly from within the tank, letting you know the session's done. It's not like someone comes into your room and knocks on the door or anything like that, although we have had to do that a couple of times.
Right.
But
I can imagine. Yeah.
yeah. And then, the one thing that you really want to keep in mind is you really want to move slowly throughout the whole experience, because there's so much salt in the water that it will really sting if it gets in your eyes, and it tastes really awful if it gets in your mouth. So your face stays dry the whole time. You're relaxing on your back with your hands above your head like that, or by your side. And then you want to get out and have a good shower after, because all that Epsom salt will just dry, and you'll turn all white. Leave it on. And we've had people that left the salt on as well after, thinking, hey, I'll just leave the salt on, it'll be like a nice scrub or something, and then they're just like completely white, and we're like, no, like go back, have a shower.
I would also like to just reiterate one of the very first times I floated, not paying any mind, attention, or awareness to the amount of salt, and then touching my face and my eyes. Oh man, my first float was brutal. I couldn't get in. Yeah. And then I touched my eyes and they stung, and I freaked out, and I got out of the tank and I'm washing my face. I'm like, this sucks. My husband's nuts. And then I got back in, I just sat and I'm just like, what am I doing here? And then obviously it got much better after that. But yes, you don't touch your face.
Yeah, and
it's
that's one of those things that everyone seems to have to do one time for some
yes.
reason. You just, for whatever reason, everyone's got to experience that. And it
never
stings
happens
a little
again.
bit more than if you were to touch, to get like ocean water on your face, right?
Yes.
So
Yep. Now, and one thing I want to mention, because I do, and every person that I've spoken to about floating and trying to convince, not convince, but like tell friends and family about it, we always go back. The most common thing people talk about is being claustrophobic. It is just, it's always the number one thing. First of all, it was my number one thing that I said to my husband, where I'm like, nope, I can't get it. Nope. And then every person that I've talked to, that's the first thing they say. And then in doing some research for this, I found some interesting points. So apparently the reality is like only 5% of the population is claustrophobic. Everyone else only thinks they are. And I thought that was hilarious. I'm like, okay, well, I'm probably one of those people. But the idea of being completely claustrophobic is this idea of a lack of control. Mm-hmm. So it's just that understanding and that sort of reluctance, because they think you have no control over your space. But in fact, like my first couple of times floating, I had to leave the door to the actual tank open a little bit, which was fine. And if that's what it kind of had to take in order for me to kind of get there. But you definitely have that option. You always know how to get out, and you can get out at any time, go back in, take the time that you need. Like I said, I left the door open like a crack. I put a little towel in it, just because of that. Like I needed to have that awareness while I was lying there, that I knew exactly how to get out if I could, and then just build my way to that. So I think it's important, because claustrophobia is that one factor most people have the most reluctance about.
Definitely. Yeah, it's 100% the most common concern that we get. I think it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction just to the idea of the enclosed space. But in reality, I don't think it's as big of a deal as people think. Like you said, I think like when I think of claustrophobia, I think of being like in a crowd of like 10,000 people, in the middle of that crowd, everybody shoulder to shoulder, and like you can't get out.
Yeah.
Whereas, in the float tank, like you said, there's all these different layers of control that you do have. You have the door, you have the light. In most cases, in a lot of cases, there'll be a light on in the tank that you can turn on and off from inside the tank. You can get out of the tank at any time. You can sit up at any time. So it's one of those things where once you kind of get over that hump of, embracing the experience and getting into it, and maybe even turning off the lights and getting that full sensory deprivation experience, the funny thing is, it actually ends up feeling almost the complete opposite of claustrophobia once you're really in it. It feels really expansive and limitless and infinite, because your body is gone. You know what I mean? For the most part, like that's kind of what it feels like. Your body's gone and your mind is left isolated without any distractions. And that feels very expansive. And there's a
Absolutely.
lot
No,
to explore from that state.
100%. And actually, so that's a great lead in into my next question. So, in discussing the benefits of floating, and which kind of leads to why do people float? And there's a variety of reasons why people float. So, can you kind of hit on some of the more, I guess, common reasons why people would?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a very effective stress reliever, because it literally turns down or turns off the stress hormones, right? That
Mhm.
fight or flight, um, stress hormones that, we kind of always have firing in today's day and age. And then it also makes your body release like natural endorphins, which are, basically your body's natural painkillers, euphoria creating chemicals. Um, Physically, it's very relaxing because you're lying in such a way that your spine is completely unraveled, right? Even more so than if you were to be like lying on the ground or lying on a yoga mat. Like your spine is literally, you know, unraveled to the point where, you can get a little more space in between your vertebrae. Um, the magnesium inside the Epsom salts is a natural muscle relaxer. So you're getting this muscle relaxation on all of your muscles happening at the same time. So when you combine like the mental relaxation with the physical relaxation, um, you can start to understand why it would be such an enjoyable experience. It's also having effects of like putting the left side of your brain in, turning that down a little bit and letting the right side of the brain kind of come to life, which is more responsible for like creativity and visualization, that sort of thing, instead of, the left side, which is more logical and dealing with numbers and, keeping you safe and things like that.
Right.
So it's almost like bringing you into this kind of relaxation, meditative sort of state, almost whether you like it or not,
Mhm.
at the same time that your physical body gets this really deep relaxation.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, people use it for all different kinds of reasons. And, and I think the cool thing about it is that people will come in with some kind of idea of what they want to get out of it, and they'll end up getting a whole bunch more just by the nature of the experience that they're immersing themselves into. Like somebody may come in for back pain or leg pain or whatever, and then end up having some kind of expansive experience where they have realizations about their life, or how they fit into it and stuff like that. So
I
I hope that was a good little recap of the
No,
benefits. Yeah.
that's great, and I think it's important to just with that intention. Like everyone, I think you're right, goes into it with some type of expectation, and sometimes I think that's good, maybe not so. In the sense that, like, I convinced my dad to go in because he has severe back issues, so he was going in for very much a physical intention. I was definitely going into it. Actually, I didn't even know. I didn't know where I was at that point. Why? But I just wanted to try it. I'm like, I have to try it. But it was definitely more. I was trying to get to more of a meditative experience, and it's important because everyone's experience will be different. And some people, I think, have sort of the reluctance of like, I'm gonna get in there and like start tripping and start seeing crap. It's like I'm not interested. Versus some, like my dad went in there and came out. I'm like, hey, so tell me about it. Like, what'd you think? He's like, oh, it was relaxing. Meh. And I'm like, awesome. Like that's great. Like
Hmm.
even that alone, I think if you can get an hour, like you said, we're just physically, you are stressless or painless in your muscles. Like I think of athletes or things like that. Like just
Yeah.
that alone, I think is fantastic.
Hmm.
Versus again going into it with certain expectations and then it not meeting them and then forget this. Where it's like no, it's very much I think a process
Hmm.
of and build up and lead up into sort of every experience I have found to be very different than the one before and just as valuable in taking something away from it.
Totally. And I also think that in this day and age, like if you think about it, like there probably used to be a lot more time, like in between times, where there was nothing going on and we didn't have this access to constant stimulation and constant distraction and just like all the information coming to us from our phones and all that, when you would have a chance to like integrate your life experience and visualize, what you want your life to be, and just contemplate and just have downtime to do nothing. And it just really serves that purpose very well, especially in this day and age where everything seems to be like speeding up, and there's just so much stimulus going on in today's world, that like to have a space, without your phone, without noises, without sound, that you can just kind of go inward and just do whatever you need to do in that space. I think that's a big reason why people really feel drawn to it and enjoy it.
And I think too, I have to say, like, that is the reason why I find now at this stage, I find it addictive. Like now I'm at the point where I haven't floated in a while. I'm like, no, like I really want to float and I really need to float. But it was that very reason in the beginning that it scared the shit out of me, because it was purposeful stillness. And it was that sort of like the stillness of my body, yes, but also of my mind. And that is something that I to this day still struggle with, and I have to make it more intentional and purposeful when I do it.
Mm-hmm.
And at the very beginning, even going into the tank, I remember the first couple of times that I went into the tank, it was very scary, and not physically, like in terms of me being in the tank. It was mental and emotional in terms of figuring out my anxiety, what is triggering me, like in terms of my day. And that I don't, like you said, there's not a lot of time for us to do that on a day-to-day basis because we're so addicted to the hustle.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a forced, I think, very necessary process that allows us to have a conversation subconsciously with ourselves, with source, whatever it is people name and sort of call that in. But I really, and for me now, like I said, it's become addictive, but it was that process of getting there. And I think
Absolutely.
really, really important, I think.
I think that's a great point, and that's something that we hear a lot. And yeah, just to kind of build on that a little bit, I think like in the tank, because there's nothing going on and there's no distractions, it's almost like you can hear your own thoughts and see them more clearly, because there's nothing preventing you from seeing them so clearly. You know what I mean? So like you're having the same thoughts that you always have, but they may kind of resonate differently when you can see them for what they really are, or see them more clearly. Yeah, it's a neat experience. I really think it's something that everyone should try if they, especially if they have access to a float tank near them. Like there's not that many float tanks around still. Like it's not that popular. So if there's one near you, it's even worth it as a novel experience just to try it out. It's not something that needs to be done all the time, although that's probably the best way to do it, because like anything, you kind of get better at it, the more you do it.
Absolutely. So one thing I want to talk about is, well, I guess from the John Lilly time era in terms of psychedelics, because I know in the early stages of floating, he experimented a lot with this idea of exploring the subconscious, and he did that through psychedelics. I think it was LSD, things like that, and then he would actually float himself and turn and it kind of document the experience of what that was like, and the spiritual connections and messages he got, and things like that. And then so over the years, as this sort of continued and he was experimenting, he actually, what's interesting, I don't think people know, is that the idea was his experimentation with psychedelics, which eventually led to realizing you don't need necessarily the medium of the psychedelic in order to achieve the same realizations or processes when you're in the tank, which I think that's kind of incredible, right? Like he's experimenting only to realize, oh, wait a second, this process, you can still achieve that same sort of level of awareness without even taking it.
Totally.
And that kind of connection, where a lot of people, in talking with like ideas of floating, I've heard like it's like you're tripping, like you're just tripping balls, and like it's like a psychedelic, and it's like, well, maybe it is, but you don't you don't it's not, again, it's not everyone's experience necessarily, and it's not about this whole psychedelic thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just curious your take on that in terms of floating in that.
Um, yeah, I mean, he did a lot of floating without psychedelics
Yeah.
for years and years and years before he started introducing them and then experimenting with them and, you know, doing really long floats with
Yes.
psychedelics in his system. And they had all types of weird contraptions to help facilitate that experience. I mean, there's definitely an overlap between the two, just in terms of, you know, communities that are interested in them, and
Yeah.
yeah, the experience that can happen inside the tank. It can be quite psychedelic, and it is for a lot of people. And we've had, you know, some very interesting reviews of people who have had, like, you know, very trippy experiences inside there. And there's one guy who he came out of the tank, and this was when we had our old style tanks, which is the ones that you're familiar with,
Yeah.
in Barrie. Like, we used to have those exact tanks that didn't have a light in the tank. So when you close that lid, it's completely pitch
Dark.
black. And he came out of the tank and he was like, "Oh, that was really cool when you guys like started that light show in there, like the purple light show."
Oh my
And like,
god.
it was cool how it just came down and it was, you know, doing its thing. I was like, "Yeah, we don't have any lights in there." Like that. He's like, "No, like you did. Like I know you did. Like what are you talking about?" And he was sure that, you know, I mean, I don't even know what to make of that, right? Like somehow something was going on in his field of vision that he was seeing, you know, a psychedelic light show.
That's
Um,
amazing. I see. I think that's incredible. I really do. I think it's incredible.
yeah.
Now,
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it can definitely be psychedelic, but I would say, like, don't come into the experience expecting that to happen,
exactly.
because, you know, I would say maybe it will happen later on once you kind of get more familiar with relaxing deeper into the experience. But what do I know? It's different for everybody, and it's not only different for everybody; it's different every time. Yeah,
Yes. No, and that's also perfect in the sense that that's where I wanted to lead that as well. It's different for everyone, and it's even floating for a long time. Every float that I've had, it's different. It's
mhm.
never the same. And
I think it's like psychedelics in the sense that, like, the psychedelic experience is very introspective and, you know, ethereal, and, you
yes,
know, you're dabbling with this connection to source energy, or whatever you want to call it, like you said.
yep,
And that's also what's going on in the tank. You're getting into some deeper thought patterns and processes where you're maybe connecting to a deeper part of yourself, deeper parts of your mind that you don't, you know, normally access. And yeah, like in that sense, they are quite similar.
and for me, and also, and I'm hoping if you're willing to share, and I totally get if you're not, because I also know that it's a personal, like these are personal experiences
I'm
that
willing
people
to
go
share.
through.
I'm willing to share.
But like, I really want to know, and I will also share because I will, of course. Um, I want to know your most impactful floating experience, and then I will tell you mine. And as well as I'm going to totally call out some parts of my husband's as well because he's not here and I can, and he said
Sure.
I can. But I'm just so interested to know. I don't know that many people that float to kind of share, and I know there are, by the way, many communities out there that I could connect with in term, and I really want to, about floating in general and the experiences and ways of which they do it. And some people take like a lot of prep before and after in terms of their experience and self-reflection. So I want to know your most impactful float experience, and sort of what happened and what it looked like, felt like.
Sure. Yeah, so I would say that, you know, because I put a little bit of thought into this, and I would say that my most impactful experience in that sense would be, so we started the center in 2014, in the middle of 2014,
Okay.
and my father passed away in 2016, so a couple years later. And, you know, so it was very helpful to have the float tanks to help, you know, integrate that experience and work through it and just process it.
Mm.
And I went in for a float sometime around that time,
Yep.
and the thought process I was having, you know, I was thinking about him, and then I was imagining him lying in his bed, for some reason. Like I was just like visualizing him lying in his bed at home.
Okay.
And then I went deeper into that thought and deeper into that thought. And then it got to a point where I sort of felt like I embodied him, like I became him for a moment,
Wow.
lying in the tank. Like it went from me looking at him to me like being him. And it was like, I'll just always remember it because it was like this key point in my process of dealing with his passing that allowed me to, just feel him fully and just accept what had happened and then move through it. And like it felt so real. It felt so real that after I still to this day see it as sort of a turning point in my process of grief and just like processing that experience. Coming out of that float, I seem to have a weight lifted off of me. There was other things that were going through my thought process during that float, but it was so trippy. It was so trippy because I didn't expect it to happen. I wasn't trying to do that. It's just where my mind went. So yeah,
That's
anytime
incredible.
someone asks me, like, I think I've only told that story like twice or something, but like, if I'm being
That's
honest, that was the trippiest experience for me.
that first of all, that's incredible.
It was
And again,
cool.
I would imagine being if I could possibly imagine being in that situation and then having that in order to move forward with your grief would be so wow. Yeah, that would just very helpful.
It's very helpful. It's very helpful as a tool for integration of
For me.
whatever's going on in your life because it's like this situation where, like I said, there's nothing else going on. It's like a pause button, right? So, we all go through all these things in our life,
Mhm.
and do we give ourselves the setting and the space to integrate all that's happening so we can, take what's working for us, or leave behind what's not working for us, do a little profile of what's happening for us. So in that sense, it's a really awesome tool, that can be utilized.
Thank you for that because that's pretty amazing.
It was cool.
That sounds amazing. I have to say, mine. I still, and for those that know me and that listen to this regularly, my biggest challenge came after my kids were born, or my sorry, after my daughter was born, my second, and going through a lot of anxiety and depression, and there's a lot was going on after, and I had to go back to work and what bit early. There's a lot going on, and was not necessarily. I call them my darker days after that in terms of how am I going to do this? What am I going to do? It resonated in so many ways, and then came to sort of connected with a spiritual healer and my husband again this whole idea of manifestation, and I'm like I don't even understand what that is, and it kind of all aligned within the same year. And then the first few times I floated, I really struggled, like to a point where it made me realize my because again, there's no one there. It's just me sitting, and I was having such a hard time sitting.
Hmm.
And then I was getting angry at myself for
Hmm.
doing this. And then I'm thinking, what? It took, I think, what, two, three times to be like, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, what is wrong with you that you cannot sit still? Like, what is wrong with you? And that was one of, and then talking to a spiritual healer at that time, and she made the comment to me saying, you don't know how to be silent. And she wasn't, and although I've heard that most of my life, in terms of being talkative or the talkative one in the class, but she's like, it's more than that. Like you have a real discomfort and you need to explore what that is and why that is. Like what is it that you don't want to deal with? Or what is it that you're not wanting to talk about or not
Hmm.
wanting to deal with? Like what is that? Why can't you just sit with yourself?
Hmm.
And I'm like, I don't know. I got stuff to do. I don't know. And it was, I think, the second or third experience where I was in the tank going through breathing exercise, like literally coaxing myself to stay still. And I don't know really how to describe what happened. It was just all of a sudden after a good, I would say I was in there for like I don't even know because I don't have a sense of time when I'm in there. I don't know how long it took me, but I became so emotional and I had no concept of why. I, I was so emotional and I'm like, I don't know why. I can't even identify why I'm crying right now. I have no idea. And I mean like it was a good
Release.
it was a release. And then when I got out, I was so tired and I felt so much better. And
Hmm.
I can't even to this day, I can't even say what I released. I have no clue. But I was all of a sudden, I was breathing different. I didn't want to I wasn't trying to rush out the door. And it was ever since, I think it was my third float.
Hmm.
I'm like, I'm hooked. And then I
Love
closed
it.
that from there. I closed the door. I lied there, like it, and it's still very hard for me at times.
Hmm.
But it was that, and even the grace of like allowing my mind to run off, and that's okay, and then just bringing it back. It's
Yeah.
no big deal, and then just keep going.
Hmm.
And it was I can't even explain it. And it was this like I want to say not that I saw light. I didn't, but I felt like a warmth. I don't know what it was, and it just was like, and
Amazing.
it was the most incredible feeling afterwards.
Hmm.
After and to this day, and I'm still working to get, I think, other questions and
Yeah.
connections going. My husband, all I will share with my husband, I won't get into detail because he was not here, but it was similar to the gentleman's story about the light show.
Okay.
He came home one day, I'm like, how was it? And he goes, I don't know, man. He's like, but there's a lot of lights. Like, what
For
lights?
sure.
There's no lights. He goes, oh no, there were lights. He goes, no, there were lights. And we kind of giggle about it. Like, I don't know what he was talking about. I've never experienced that necessarily. But he's mentioned that a few times about
Hmm.
being there in a state where he just kept seeing different shades, different brightnesses of
Hmm.
light. And
Very cool.
I thought that was really, really cool. And then there was my dad, made him go. And like I said, he went, thought it was great, came out. He goes, man, it was all right.
Yeah.
I'm like, what happened? He goes, nothing. What happened? I almost
Yeah.
fell asleep.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. It's like everyone's experience is so different, still valuable in of its own right, but so different.
Totally.
So next question, please tell everyone listening how they can get a hold of you, or at least where to go to your center to book a float.
Great. Yeah. So we're Float Toronto. Our website is float-toronto.com. And we have a very user-friendly interface. You can book your sessions online. All the information is there. And we're located on the west side of Toronto, so kind of near Dufferin and Queen. We're on Queen Street, about half a block west of the Drake Hotel, if anybody knows where that is. Yeah, we have 5 float tanks. They're all the same, so you don't have to worry about which one you book. And you can, if you have a friend, you guys can both come at the same time and go in your own rooms. And yeah, there's a few other float centers in Ontario too. I'll just rattle them off quickly. Just the names of them. There's Float Tank Barrie. That's the one that you go to. Yep. There's Float Valley. That's in Markham. There's Float Vaughan. There is Go Float in Burlington. So yeah, there's a few out there. Just if you Google just float tank in your area, I'm sure you'll find it.
And even just that, I just want to identify that for a really quick second, like just the community of it, and like mentioning all of them, and just demonstrates to me like just that community in terms of cohesion of not just business, because business is important, but also just the experience, just get it out to as many people as
totally possible. No, we're all tight, we're all buddies, and the community is pretty tight, to be honest. It's not really a competitive thing like that. We're all working together in a certain kind of way, and really you're going to float at the place that's closer to you, right? So there's not really a competition in that kind of way. So all the people that live around us float here, and if you live in Barrie, you're going to float there. So yeah.
Well, I will make sure that all that information and website and stuff, contact information, will be in our show notes below, and then they can get in touch with you directly, or again, at least try and find hopefully a center near them and venture into an amazing experience for sure.
Totally. Yeah. If anyone has any questions, just obviously feel free to reach out in any way. Awesome. And yeah, go have a float. Go try it out. Enjoy it.
Go float. Oh yeah, as they should. So Jesse, thank you so very much for doing this. I truly appreciate it. And I'll end here, but don't go anywhere.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks, Stephanie.